Such a pleasure today to be joined on episode 192 by Ethan Chatagnier. I think I messed it up this time. Did I say it right?
I think you said Catania. It was Chatagnier. Yeah.
Chatagnier. It's a pleasure to talk to you. We've been, talking for a while. I've been a fan of you. You're a great Twitter follow. You're a great social media follow with some of the dry humor and such. And had the pleasure to read The Singer Distance. That's going to be the main focus of our conversation. But official welcome and to a fellow California. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, and thank you so much for having me on it. It's great to be joining the pod.
Oh man, such a pleasure. I'd love to know you were talking about before we were recording, growing up in kind of the Bay Area, East Bay. I'd love to know about your relationship with language, what you were reading and or writing, from in those early days.
Yeah, I grew up in Concord, which is kind of like the far side of the East Bay. It's east of the
Hmm.
Caldecott Tunnel, so it's not like Oakland and Berkeley where it's really core Bay Area. Some
Yeah,
people would
yeah,
would say that's probably too far out on the fringes to be the Bay Area. So it didn't feel like super metropolitan or anything
yeah,
like
yeah,
that. Um, and I mean, I think I just mostly felt like a pretty normal suburban
yeah. Hmm.
suburban wasteland type place growing up. Reading, I think I was kind of in and out of being a serious reader. Like I wasn't one of those kids who like always had a book in his hand all the time from
Hmm.
being a kid. I think I had some like fallow periods, and then I'd find something that would start up a new interest. Like I'd get into a new author. Like I remember reading as a kid, going to the library, getting picture books and short chapter books and stuff. And then I remember like middle school, I got like a John Saul book from a
Wow. Yeah, yeah.
like a Scholastic book fair or something, and that got
Mhm.
me into this John Saul phase.
Hmm.
Um, and he has had a bunch of books out that were kind of like, I guess, light horror, kind of. I
Yeah,
feel like
yeah.
maybe Stephen King light almost.
Hmm.
And so I read a bunch of those, and then I don't remember reading a bunch of other stuff. I read I read in middle school a lot was like Dungeons and Dragons
Oh
books,
yeah.
like the fantasy novelizations, Forgotten Realms type stuff. So that
Hmm.
that kept me going for a while. Um, and then in early high school, I think my freshman year, we had like silent reading time in class, so you have to read for 25 minutes.
Yeah.
And one of my teachers had a library, and I picked up a John Grisham book from that, and I
Okay.
like John Grisham. I think it was The Client. And so then I read a bunch of John Grisham books, and then I probably went out of kind of reading heavily, actively on my own. Um, and I think it was probably junior or senior year where I started to get a little more literary and want to
Hmm.
read stuff on my own, and probably in kind of a pretentious sort of way where I was like, I'm going to be a literary guy, um, and and started kind of picking up some stuff. I remember I started trying to read like Shakespeare plays on my own and stuff.
Yeah. How long did that last?
Um, Probably like two plays.
Sure. Yeah.
I think I probably
That's
read
not
two,
bad. Farther than I
then
went. Shoot.
stopped reading them on my own for a while. Yeah,
Well, shoot. The name John Saul brings back memories. I don't know that I ever read a John Saul, but like, I think my brother was into like Dean Koontz,
yeah, yeah.
which I thought was kind of like just the name itself was a little forbidding. But for some reason, the name John Saul was so forbidding to me. It was just like, dang, it's just dark.
Yeah, it has kind of a dark and serious ring to it. And I
Right.
wasn't like a horror reader.
Hmm.
Mostly I just kind of found my way to the book and then followed the author. But it's
Yeah.
interesting that it didn't like branch off, because I didn't start reading Dean Koontz after that or Stephen
Hmm.
King after that.
Sure.
I just kind of like I'd find an author and then stick with them.
Yeah, yeah. So you were talking about again before recording about like the wrestling career, like even taking you to college, like looking to find a good college wrestling program. Like, so was this like a matter of you being like a jock and like, bro, we don't read, or like were you like would you call yourself like a jock? I mean, wrestling, is obviously not the most popular like spectator sport, but man, it is tough, right?
Yeah, it's really challenging. I think it's one of the most intensive sports you can be in.
Gotta
And maybe
be.
that's wrestler chauvinism talking that I
Oh,
still have left over. But it's pretty demanding. It's taxing. A wrestling match is 6 minutes long,
mm,
and that 6 minutes of wrestling can feel like 2 hours on the
yep.
court. you know,
Yeah.
it'll take it out of you.
Right. Well, yeah. So how did the transfer not the transformation, but like how did you go from being so focused on wrestling and being being a reader, but all of a sudden to sounds like you really got into the creative writing in college, and I'm not sure what grad school and all that too, but kind of where were these eureka moments if they were that salient?
I mean, I think I was always kind of desperate for something I could like be good at and stand out in. And
Mhm.
wrestling, I was a pretty quick study in wrestling. Was also small. I've always been the smallest kid in my classes in high school
Mhm.
and that kind of thing. And and high schools are usually kind of desperate for small kids to be in the
Mhm.
lowest weight class, and
Mhm.
you can sometimes like sneak onto the varsity squad early because you need a
Uh-huh.
103 pounder and there's
Sure.
no juniors or seniors who are small enough, so
Uh,
you can get on varsity as like a sophomore, and so that was exciting to me. I was looking for like a sneaky way in,
mhm.
um, and then writing that kind of picked up. Um, my junior year of high school when I started trying to like write song lyrics and some basic poetry and stuff. And I had a teacher that year, an English teacher who was really good,
Mm.
and she like read one of my creative writing assignments aloud to the class, and she's like, "I'm pretty sure this kid's going to be a writer."
Mm.
And for some reason that stuck with me. I guess just
Wow.
a hint of praise. I'm like, I'm going that direction.
Yeah. Wow. So we're talking like, I mean, I know writers are famously self-deprecating. Like, were your song lyrics like fire? Are we talking like Leonard Cohen, like Tori Amos? Are we talking like,
Uh,
I don't know.
I don't know. I don't think I've saved any of them. I can only presume that they were
Okay.
extremely bad. Um, and
Just like,
I didn't have any musical talent. I wasn't like in a band or about to be
okay.
in a band.
Okay.
Um, but I think I just wanted. I think I was looking for something that would impress girls, and that's
Yeah.
that's not not really the best way to do that. But uh, for some reason, for that, I guess I chose the hard way.
There you go. So tell me about Fresno State. You talked about some of the great mentors you had there. Just that story you were telling about the teacher who gave you those words of encouragement. I was thinking of one Felipe Herrera.
Oh yeah, he's great.
He's
He's
incredible, right?
yeah,
But
and
he always talks
he
about being so young, like second, third grade, and one of the teachers was just like, "You have such a great voice," reading his
yeah.
work out loud, and that catapulted him to this day. Sorry to cut you off. What were you going to say?
I was just gonna say that was one of the really cool things about coming to Fresno State, which I didn't choose for the writing program at all. I chose because I thought I was gonna walk onto the wrestling team, and they had a great history on the wrestling team. And then it got canceled, I think, my sophomore year,
Ooh,
and I didn't end up walking on anyway. But yeah, one Felipe Herrera, he wasn't. I don't think he was as like famous then. Like it was
mm-hmm.
before he was the National Poet Laureate 2 years
Right.
in a row and stuff. But he was like a guy who'd come around campus and do presentations. And
Mm-hmm.
like, if you've ever been in a room and heard him speak, it's just like incredible energy. And we think
Yes,
of like
yes,
literary readings as often like kind of quiet and
right.
dry things, but he's like a ringleader in there where he's just like
Hmm.
making everybody laugh, making everybody smile.
For reals.
And so you have some of those presences around Fresno. Um,
Mm.
and then in the writing program, I got in and I started as an undergrad taking creative writing workshops. First with Liza Wieland, who was a
Mm-hmm.
great writer and mentor to me, and also with Steve Yarbrough. They were the two
Mm.
fiction professors at the time. Um, and they were both excellent and have done a lot of great teaching and brought up a lot of great writers. And so I left undergrad. I don't think I completely knew this at the time, but I kind of had what I needed from there where I could
Mm.
point myself in the right direction. I knew how to read, I knew how to think about craft and how to figure out ways to develop my craft on
Mm-hmm.
my own by reading carefully and by thinking about intent and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, I appreciate that. So like, getting into like the Singer Distance, which came out what, October last year?
Yeah, October.
And obviously, pardon the pun, there's a lot of distance between, college and then like
Yeah.
who are some of the writers? Thank you for that pity laugh. Who are some of the writers or writing that really kind of shaped this book? Like, I forget who I was reading about somebody else today who I think it's uh, Kwong, who wrote Yellowface,
Oh yeah, R.F. Kuang. Yeah.
R.F. Kwong, right? And she was talking about how she's just trying to do something totally different. There was Babel. I haven't read any of her stuff, but heard great things. Cannot wait. And then Yellowface was, it's been another blockbuster, and she's talking about the third one's just going to be totally. So like my long-winded way of getting at, like, did you, like, have you been reading and writing all, like, I don't know. I guess I want to ask you too. I mean, is this speculative fiction? It's not quite, So is this something like, hey, I wrote about this. This is not what I always write about, or it's like this is what I've really settled on because I've read, Matt Bell, who gives you a great blurb, and these kind of folks. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And it's a good question because I am a bit envious of writers, I think, who like just have a thing and
Mm-hmm.
do that thing perfectly and everything they write is pointing in that direction.
Sure.
I've always been pretty like omnivorous and wide ranging in a
Yeah.
way. Sometimes I worry means like, okay, my writing doesn't have as much of a strong identity as some of those other writers. Um, but I just kind of find my writing interests lie in a lot of various directions. And so
Mm-hmm.
I never really thought of myself as a sci-fi writer before I
Mm-hmm.
had this like book out on the sci-fi shelves of bookstores.
Mm.
Um, but I have for a while, my process has felt very premise driven, where like
Okay.
it starts at the idea stage and then I'm feeling out what characters resonate with that idea, what
Mm-hmm.
setting resonates with that idea, and kind of how the plot's going to work within that. um, and so a lot of times, if you're looking for strong ideas, a lot of times that leads, I think, a little bit toward the speculative, or to something that's kind of high concept. um,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the case here. And it branched off. The inspiration came from a non-speculative book. This is a book, Equilateral by Ken Kalfus. I'm not sure if
Okay.
you know
I've heard
this
of it.
one.
I don't know.
um, but it's about a astronomer around the the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
um, carving out a giant equilateral triangle to set on fire to try and talk to Mars. And that one's not
Uh,
speculative exactly because there are no Martians to answer back.
sure.
Um, but it's this kind of really, really interesting idea, and that caught me. And then
Mm.
the speculative what if branched off of that, and
Yeah.
so I just kind of had to head in that direction.
Yeah. Who are some of the writers of of today who are really? I mean, because you're so good at world building. I mean, it's in the same way, like a magical realism or something you read, and it's like, the old man with enormous wings, and you're whatever a paragraph in, you're like, okay, cool, the guy's got wings. Like
Yeah.
next, like as a compliment, like I mean, you made things that are science fiction. You made them like, okay, cool, palatable for sure, and like understandable for the layman and all that. But I guess so the world building is so extensive and so powerful. Who are some of those you really like? Man, she can really build a world.
Thank you. You mentioned R.F. Kuang a minute ago, and I thought Babel was really interesting in that way. I read that
Uh
earlier
huh.
this year. Um, Erica Swyler, I
Okay.
think she's done a book that's kind of um, traveling circus and tarot mysticism and sort of curses. It's also like this one. It's got kind of an allegorical literary feel
Mm-hmm.
mixed with that. And then her second book was also had that kind of allegorical sort of feel, like From Other Stars, but in a sci-fi direction.
Mm.
So she's brilliant at that, and she's a favorite of mine.
Yeah.
And for this book, one of the things that kind of unlocked novel writing for me, which I was really struggling with, was getting into Kazuo Ishiguro.
Ah.
And the way his premises, he tends to work with a world that's tilted just a little, right? Like where
Okay.
it's very much recognizable as our world with this one change that,
Mm.
usually it's speculative in some ways, like
Mm-hmm.
clones in Never Let Me Go, or like AI robots, AI robot friends in Clara and the Sun,
Mm.
or kind of a fantasy setting, but one that has that allegorical sort of feel in The Very
Yeah.
Giant. And and I always like the way that it's kind of that bit of small world building where it's not building a world from the ground up,
Yeah.
but it's this like funhouse mirror that reveals things about the world by
Mm.
distorting them in a way.
That makes sense. Yeah, just slightly off a little bit. It's our world, but it's our world minus or our world plus, I guess, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. That makes a lot of sense. So I guess like my question is about balancing the plot and the science. The I was thinking of, one of the big revelations towards the end, which I'm not going to give away, but it was almost for me, it was almost like have you ever read Animal Farm?
Yeah.
When sorry if I'm spoiling the plot for anybody here. The book's only what 70 years old or whatever, but when Napoleon gets up and walks on two legs, I remember almost literally being like, you know, and
Yeah.
I had that same sort of gasp at that revelation towards the end, on the trip with father and daughter, and I was like, man, so the plot is so interesting, the way that everything comes back together in the end, etc. The plot just really keeps it going, but it's also like, man, cool science and the Martians and the trip and academia. So I wonder about how much, I guess, research you had to do even. And then I guess maybe if you can start off by just giving us a little bit of a summary, especially of, like, I guess, that first trip, like where the
Yeah.
book starts off. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a little bit weird, I found, to summarize, because you have to almost start with the backstory.
Sure.
Um, and so the backstory is that it's based off some real scientific history where an Italian astronomer saw channels on Mars through his telescope in like the late 1800s.
Hmm.
Telescopes were not very powerful
Yeah.
then and couldn't see Mars that well. And so he wrote about these canali that he found channels, and it got mistranslated into English as canals. And then other astronomers started looking for and seeing canals, and many thought that they were not man-made, but intelligently designed canals that were signs of civilization. So not every astronomer thought that. I would, from what I've read, I think it was more than a fringe theory, but
Hmm.
not the majority theory.
Yeah.
Uh, and and so there was this whole idea for 20 or 30 years that Mars could be inhabited, and that's when you start seeing War of the Worlds come out and
Mhm.
other Martian stuff in pop culture. And there were suggestions of doing things like answering that research question by pointing a bunch of gigantic mirrors at Mars and trying to
Mm.
signal them. Um, so there's that history, and then Ken Kalfus was kind of exploring that history in Equilateral,
Mm.
and the twist that I put on it is I thought, what if there was a civilization on Mars and they were there to answer back to this sort of huge installation that Earth put up. And I thought the interesting take on that is, what if they just don't care that much
Uh,
about people or humans? And I come out of a literary short fiction writing background, so I'm always looking for the like saddest possible things. I'm like,
right.
the loneliest thing would be having a civilization next door to us that just doesn't care about us. It just isn't interested. Um, and so that felt like the thematic axis
Okay.
that I wanted to work with. And I had that idea for a long time. And it wasn't until the foreground story clicked into place like 7 years later
Yeah.
that I started writing it. So the main action of this book takes place after it's been 30 years since people have been able to solve a Martian math proof. The
Mhm.
communication between Earth and Mars is all mathematics. They put up a proof or a test of some kind, and we try and answer it. And if we do, we get a new problem. Uh, but the problems get harder and harder, and Einstein solves the last one in 1932 or 33. I'd have to check the pages to be sure.
Yeah.
And then for 30 years, no one can solve a problem, and we don't hear from Mars, and the world gets disaffected about this
Mhm.
idea of Mars communication. And then the foreground story is 1960. A young grad student named Crystal Singer cracks the problem, or at least she thinks she has. And so her boyfriend Rick and a few of their friends go on a cross country journey to like paint this gigantic Mars proof in the desert. to try and signal Mars and put her theory to the test.
Appreciate that. So there's the what five, like you said, five overall. Rick, I saw Crystal Singer with the last name, and I was like, for some reason, I was thinking through much of the book that it was Rick Singer.
Uh,
I was like, is he gonna grow up to be the guy? He was the guy who was like the who like started the scandal for like the college recruiting. You know what I'm talking about?
oh, really? Yeah,
So I was like, is he gonna grow up to be that guy or no?
I didn't know that though. I found out later after the book was already going to print that there's a Mercedes Lackey book called Crystal Singer, like a fantasy book.
Oh wow.
That's a cool little bit of trivia. I don't know.
Huh.
Maybe I would have changed it if I'd seen it before that, but I'm kind of
Yeah.
happy with the coincidence.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, so I guess the speculative part and just about it being instead of 1960, like, and just ideas of optimism. I mean, there's a lot of pessimism in the book for sure. You mentioned some of it just about like, loneliness and distance and lack of connection. But it the fact that like women are in pretty high positions, that she's 1960s, she's a female who's her work is propped up and all that. Is that like kind of the kind of nonchalantness of it is so cool. Like, is there something to that where it's just like, you know what? Yeah, that's the world that in this book, that she can get these opportunities because she's ridiculously smart. Or was it like a kind of like a political statement? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I didn't want it to be highly political, but when
Uh-huh.
I was thinking about, who the characters were going to be when I first started writing it, I knew immediately it should not be a brilliant man
Right. A male
solving
phenom
this and
prodigy.
then the girlfriend just there to
Hmm.
support him, because
Hmm.
that's, it feels stodgy and dated
Yeah,
and,
yeah, yeah.
like a male self-congratulatory thing. And it felt much more interesting to say, okay, here's this genius woman in a time where, there were not many women in allowed into the fields of mathematics or
Right.
encouraged into the field of mathematics or other fields like that. Um, and so it felt good. It felt more interesting. It felt like it gave it, a little even more of an underdog characteristic,
Hmm.
because people are not in 1960 are not going to readily accept the idea that a woman is the smartest mathematician in the world. But if she solves this Martian math proof, then it's unequivocally true, and there's not really any arguing it.
Hmm. Towards the end of the book, and this is speaking about something else, but I think it fits like Crystal and Rick's relationship. They're he's thinking about asking her to marry him. They're enamored of each other, and we'll talk about kind of maybe an unequal relationship in some ways, but there's clearly love, there's clearly concern, there's clearly affection. So it's kind of like the other three are kind of like sometimes when they're getting kind of romantic, PDA if you will. But the line from the book, which is so good just outside of the context, but within the context even better, is quote, some feelings exceed our recording capacity. So I wonder about like this relationship, and they're so in love, and Rick loves watching Crystal just think and be curious, and just look off into the distance, and they have philosophical and scientific and mathematical conversations. Is some of this book's staying power, some of the book's allegory about like kind of like the Romeo and Juliet idea of just like this fiery love when you're young, kind of like a Foo Fighters Everlong. Like, can this ever last? Can it be like this forever?
Yeah, well, and I knew it was in this unstable state in the
Mm,
beginning where they are like passionately in love with each other, but also Rick is maybe more passionately in love with Crystal than she
mm-hmm.
is with him, because she's got this big other focus on
Yeah.
Mars and he's focused only on her.
Mm,
Um, and so I knew that that early theme going on that was kind of behind my whole interest in the idea was this idea of closeness and distance, like a civilization on Mars being so close,
mm,
but then being like emotionally distant, basically. And so I wanted to set
right.
up a scenario where we could do that and start with that intense closeness and
Mm-hmm.
then move things to a greater distance and see how it plays out.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. You talk about like unstable, the lack of stability. There's that great garbage analogy, and I don't mean the analogy is garbage. I mean it's about garbage. I forget exactly who gave it, but just the idea of it might have been
It was
Crystal's dad.
Carl Singer's
Yeah,
Carl Crystal's dad.
right. I wonder if you could maybe talk about that a little bit, how that connects to their relationship, like about kind of being a cheerleader for one or the other, and just the garbage analogy.
Yeah, I mean it was so the analogy is Rick is asking Crystal's dad for his blessing because he's planning to
Mhm.
propose. And at first he kind of says no, he's unenthusiastic about it. Who's going to measure up to her? And Rick
Mm.
says he doesn't plan to, but he does plan to like take care of her. And that's when
Right.
Carl shifts and he says like, um, a marriage is about figuring out who's going to take out the trash. Both people can take out the trash, or only one person can take out the trash, but it doesn't work if both people don't take out the trash.
Mm.
Um, and I forget what Rick's exact response is, but I think he says like he can manage that, and that's
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
I like about Rick is that he's pretty ready to just be the support and
Mm.
kind of give Crystal what he needs because he sees something great in her, and he doesn't want to surpass that. He doesn't want to bring it down.
Yeah.
He just wants to do what it takes to be with her and to keep her going.
Yeah. So so again, they're from MIT, and even amongst these huge brains, Crystal is above and beyond in so many ways. She's just and then like you talked about a little bit, maybe the nonfiction part of it. The fiction part of it is what, when Mars is in opposition. Am I saying that right?
Yeah,
So when Mars is in opposition to the Earth, comes up not that often. There are these messages that are dropped, and there are these responses. Was it the first one where the four parallel lines were shown in response by on Mars, or was
yeah,
it?
that was the
Yeah.
first response. The yeah, in the early draft, and when I
Mm-hmm.
first started drafting, Earth actually sent an equilateral triangle like they did in the Ken
Ah,
Kalfas book because I was thinking like, oh, that's a cool nod to the book that inspired it, and then I thought
right.
about it more, and I thought that's copyright infringement, you know. Um,
You do mention intellectual property in the book, right? So
yeah,
maybe it could be a suing there.
yeah. But I've talked with Ken, my the
Nice.
publisher put me in touch with him, and he was really great and supportive.
Oh man, I love that, the community of writers and creatives. That's so cool. So they end up like with Rick being like the planner. Again, he's not some dumb, he knows his stuff, but he's the one who put together all the trucks and all the materials for them to do their own message in New Mexico, right?
Yeah, in Arizona. Yeah.
In Arizona, excuse me. Close to the previous one. And so they definitely under the cover of night and secretive, and they get it done with the help of those five. And it seems like you talk about, the closeness is there, like it's not easy work, and there are some disagreements and such, but it's a beautiful moment. They take pictures, they send them into the newspapers, they get more than their 15 minutes of fame. But it's kind of like, sorry to keep going back to that, but that Everlong thing is like, things were as good as they can get, maybe, at this point, at the age of what, 23, 24 kind of thing. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like not the backlash, but just like fame. Fame hits them after they've shown this message. They got a reply, and they're just like, talk about popular science in the days when they were like public intellectuals, right?
Yeah.
They're all over the news and that kind of thing. I wonder about how the five of them, especially Crystal, dealt with that fame.
Yeah, well, I think you kind of hit upon what needed to happen with the book when you said this was the best it could possibly be.
Mm-hmm.
They succeeded in putting their message down. They
Yeah.
succeeded in getting a response, and that means Crystal's proof
Right.
was correct, and it's this great, once in a lifetime victory. Um, and you know, both
And
kind
I'm
of
sorry,
plot wise.
I'm
Oh,
sorry
go
to
ahead.
interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, because I didn't really state it, and I'm thinking you did. So you say proof as in like a mathematical proof.
Yeah, mathematical proof.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mention that before. That was her. It was her idea. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So things can't really get better than that. They can only go downhill in some ways, and maybe in real life they don't necessarily have to, but especially book wise, that's the time where there needs to be a big reversal, and everything goes
Yeah.
from this moment of triumph to things going wrong. Otherwise the book's done there on page 75 or whatever.